Throughout history, anyone with a disability was considered helpless and destitute beings. Disabilities have always been viewed as something shameful, ugly, defective, and in need of a cure. Citizens with a disability were forced to be locked away in institutions and asylums where the treatment there was horrifically cruel. There, patients with disabilities ranging from mental disorders to disfigurements were shut away and dehumanized. Patients were often left neglected, locked up, and tied to furniture for hours on end. Citizens were denied equal opportunity and equal treatment just because they were different. It wasn't until the 1940s and 50s, when injured veterans returned home from war, that a new light was shed on disabilities. This would prove to be a crucial turning point in history. When World War II veterans returned home with newly acquired disabilities, a new perspective on disabilities began to take form. The returning men pressured the government to provide them with new rehabilitation programs in return for their great sacrifices. Citizens had their eyes opened to disabilities and began to see past a person's wheelchair. Even though the disabled community made up a large portion of the nation, disabled persons were still faced with physical and social barriers. A majority of the disabled population was forced into institutions, care homes, or nursing homes. Others were dependent on family members or friends to take care of them and make decisions for them. People with disabilities had little to no access to the outside world. The obstacles in life made it increasingly difficult for those with a disability to have access to anything. There were no ramps, curb cuts, or even automatic doors. As a result, those with a disability did not have access to public transportation, shops, restaurants, restrooms, or anywhere. The disabled community was discriminated against daily and was denied public services because of their wheelchair, crutches, or their appearance. It was common for someone to refuse services to a person with a disability because their equipment or their appearance might offend or frighten customers. Even in society, there was a cruel and unjust treatment to people with a disability. The discrimination people with a disability faced was overwhelming. In the 1960s, social movements began to take place. Advocates seized the opportunity and for the first time began demanding equal treatment. Joining in on the many other civil rights protests, they began breaking down the physical and social barriers. Parents began demanding that their children be released from the hands of institutions and asylums and care homes. And for the ones not confined in institutions, they demanded equal access to public services. Disability rights activists took a stand and challenged the viewpoints on disabilities. Disability activists and advocates rallied protests, staged sit-ins, and even obstructed buses and buildings that didn't provide equal access to show that they too deserved civil rights. In 1972, President Nixon vetoed a law that would grant equal access to those with a disability. The president's actions caused uproar in the disabled community. Fierce protests took place nationwide. In one particular protest in New York City, 80 people staged a sit-down on Madison Avenue, causing traffic to stop. After the persistence of the disability rights activists, Congress overrode President Nixon's veto and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was passed. This act was a pivotal point, as this was the first time in history that the civil rights of people with a disability were protected by law. Now, equal access for all is beginning to take place. The first curb cut was set up in Berkeley, California. The first of ramps and such were making their way all around. Soon after, parents wanted their children to have the same opportunities of children without a disability. This led to the creation of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. This act ensured that every child has a right to an education and provided school children with equal access to an education. The act was later renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This further stressed the idea of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, but now included the parents' rights to be involved with their children's education. This act started the Individualized Education Plan, which is designed with parents and teachers to meet the child's educational needs. Even with the new Rehabilitation and Education Act, the civil rights of those with a disability were still not fully addressed. The disabled community rallied for the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which would fully protect their rights as citizens. In the spring of 1990, members of the American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit gathered at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. for a rally known as the Capitol Crawl. This rally was organized with Congress to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. There, protesters flocked to the building and lifted themselves out of their wheelchairs and began crawling up the steps of the Capitol building. Using their hands, elbows, backs, or whatever they could, inch by inch, they moved their way up towards the building that was once inaccessible to them. A 9-year-old girl named Jennifer Keelan was the youngest to climb up the steps of the Capitol building. It is said that the sight of her crawling up the steps is what led to the final decision of signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA was finally signed into law on July 26, 1990. This act prohibited discrimination against any disability and ensured equal access in employment, public services, telecommunications, and many more. This act ultimately granted full rights to people with a disability. The persistence of the disability rights activists paid off. Their impact and their determination shaped the way our society embraces differences and how we perceive our freedom.